For the past 18 years, a steady hand has been on the tiller at the Federal Reserve Board. Its chairman, Alan Greenspan, has been described as the second most important person in the world, after the president. Given his long and distinguished tenure, a change at the helm is significant and potentially unsettling. What will the new Fed chairman, Ben Bernanke, be like? And what might this change mean for you and me? I'm Sarah Bartlett, and this is our topic today on USA Inc. Joining us today is Louis Uchitelle, a senior economics writer for the New York Times, author of a forthcoming book called The Disposable American, and someone who has the advantage of already knowing Chairman-to-be Bernanke well. Lou, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Tell us why you think the Fed chairmanship is an important position to us. Why should we care?
Well, he has the ability to regulate the economy, particularly this economy, which is so dependent on credit at a time when the wages of 80% of the workforce are not keeping up with inflation. You have to, the economy is essentially running on their borrowing power and the refinancing of housing. And all of that depends very much on what interest rates are, and the Fed, of course, controls the interest rates. This has been the way we've been regulating the economy now for close to a generation. And so Bernanke is going to play a very important role in that process, a role that Paul Volcker, for all practical purposes, initiated at a time when other forms of government stimulus were being withdrawn. Alan Greenspan continued, and now Ben Bernanke has that challenge.
I've seen some reports that have said maybe he's less important now, that the global economy is such that he really doesn't have as much control or ability to influence the economy as prior Fed chairmen.
Well, there is a difference, which he himself, I think, recognizes as much as anyone. The Fed chairmen have pretty much, and Wall Street for that matter, run on the assumption that we have a closed or a semi-closed economy or a sufficiently closed economy so that when they raise and lower interest rates, there will be some response within this economy. Shortages that had developed will cease to exist as rates go up and people can't borrow as much and therefore they can't buy as much. But that's much diluted these days because of the global supply. Now you can raise rates, and if it doesn't affect the dollar, for example, you still have this huge flow of goods coming in from China and the rest of the world. In fact, our imports today of manufactured goods represent, well, there's a debate as to what the exact number is, but it's well over 20 or 25% of what we consume. And that's up from a much smaller percentage just 10 or 15 years ago.
So are they anachronistic now? Is this an institution that really can't affect change?
No, they can. Those rates, Bernanke has a very difficult situation, I think, right now. The economy is running on relatively low rates, that is for refinancing housing, if nothing else, and for the housing boom that has been a big source of economic growth, not only a source of taking equity out of your house in order to purchase, but just the number of people employed in one form or another in the housing business, if you will. Some people put that at 16% of the economy, some people put it at less. Whatever it is, it plays a big role. Renovation is a big, something like $200 billion or more a year, which is like equal to 2 percentage points of the GDP, gross domestic product. So he has to be careful about what he does. And Bernanke has a history of being very well aware of deflation. He's written books about it. He's a student of what happened during the Depression. He became very concerned about it as a Fed governor a couple of years ago when that issue of deflation or potential deflation was afoot. And he did, I think, disagree a bit with the Greenspan Fed as to what to do about interest rates, although nothing of any significance at that time.
Do you have any sense of how the Bernanke Fed might differ from a Greenspan Fed?
Well, there's something that's happened during the Greenspan years that Bernanke will have to deal with it, whether he likes it or not. And there are some indications, I've written a little about it, but he himself, in an article that was published by the Minneapolis, the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, in their in-house publication, not so in-house, but one of their publications that they send around to all sorts of important people and journalists who aren't so important, but opinion makers, and in which he raised concerns about issues that are beyond the control of interest rate policy, that is monetary policy. Over the years of the Greenspan Fed, and well, let's go back to Carter. Over the years, let's not blame it on Greenspan, let's go back to all the way back to Carter, we have been deregulating the economy. One of the things that has become very deregulated is banking, credit, lending. You can go out. Heck, my daughter and son-in-law went out and they got themselves a no interest or an interest-only 7-year mortgage to buy a house. It drove me crazy, and I finally talked him into going to a 30-year mortgage. There's a lot of that out there, and a lot of the lenders are taking risks that they wouldn't take if they thought they would have to bear the default. But we have this system now of being able to sell. Lenders are able to sell the mortgages, package them as securities and sell them as bonds, which you and I buy, and presumably if there's a default there will be many people hurt, but no one terribly. Well, but the problem with that is that it encourages risky lending, and Bernanke is going to have to face the problem of reining in that lending. That's not an interest rate thing, and he has already indicated, although never publicly yet, except in this article, and that he is aware of the need to perhaps be more to put some of the rules back in place.
It sounds like you think then that the banking sector might come under tighter rein, and I assume that that will mean that for consumers it will become more difficult to get low-interest loans. Is that
or
that
more
correct?
difficult to get loans without the necessary down payment, without some sort of down payment. More difficult, perhaps, to get loans that are interest only. There are loans out there now where you don't even have to pay the interest. You can pay less than the interest, and they add the principal, the unpaid interest onto the principal. That perhaps Bernanke will try to reverse a bit. It's a dangerous business because we're in it. If he reverses it, that's a little bit like raising interest rate. You sort of restrict the credit, which drives the economy, and then where are you? So it's
Yes.
not an easy process.
I mean, that could theoretically turn us back into a recession, right?
Absolutely.
If you cut off credit like that?
Sure. You
or,
could,
or constrict it?
Or constrict it a bit. Yes, that could push us back into it. So he has, the path we're on right now is not a very easy one. And I can only say that, I mean, there was a time back when the stock market was booming, when everybody said that Greenspan should raise the margin requirements and use his influence to restrict the amount of borrowing in order to buy stocks. That might have eased it a little bit. And something similar will go on now in the Bernanke period. And how that will come out, I don't know.
Well, Greenspan was very reluctant to do that. So are you saying that one of the key differences between the two administrations, if you will, of the Fed is that one is more likely to look at non-interest rate methods of modulating the economy compared with Greenspan? Is that?
I would say that's very well described on your part. Yeah, that's exactly. If there's a difference between them, it will show up there, I think. I'm not sure of that.
Right.
But that's where Bernanke has made some noises to the effect that that's where a difference might lie. The other place where it might show up is in Bernanke's concern about deflation, whereas, I mean, he is fully aware. When Greenspan came in 1987, we did have a more or less closed economy, much more closed than now. There was really a situation where you could use interest rates to solve shortages. We don't have shortages anymore, not in this global economy, and they get less and less. And we have downward pressure on wages. We have endless supplies of goods and now services coming from abroad. There isn't the upward pressure on prices that there once was. That doesn't mean that there isn't inflation.
How much of a problem do you think inflation is likely to be for us in the next few years?
I think it'll be a very manageable problem. I think that there will not be the inflationary pressures that a Volcker faced or that a Greenspan faced.
And the reason for that?
And the reason is the global supply.
Mm-hmm.
And
can you
also
just
the
explain
supply.
The mechanism for why would that make such a difference?
Well, in the day, the mechanism, to oversimplify it a bit, if everything that we consume in goods, cars, clothing, whatever, is produced in this country, and nothing is consumed outside the country, if people have too much buying power, then you run into shortages. Capacity gets used up. That's a phrase that used to be on everybody's lips once. Not enough workers to go around, not enough factory capacity to turn out. If people are buying 100 shirts and want to buy 100 shirts and only 50 are being produced.
And now?
Now you have a global economy. People want to buy 100 shirts. We produce 50 in this country. Well, there's 150 more ready to cross the border from China. In fact, we're probably producing 25 in this country, and 300 are ready to cross the border. So there's an endless supply, and then there is also labor is not as tight as the 5% unemployment rate might indicate, because if you look at the labor force participation rate, that is the number of people who are bothering even to look for a job, it's declining. It's the most amazing thing. We're in a recovery, but the labor force participation rate, instead of going up, is dropping a little bit.
We will be right back.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with New York Times senior economics writer Louis Uchitelle. It doesn't sound like wage increases are in our future, based on your description.
Well, because there's so much labor out there, either within the country or outside the country, there isn't much pressure, and you can see it in this recovery. Instead of, it should be drawing more and more people into the labor force, either looking for work or working, and it's, in fact, the percentages are dropping a bit, and that suggests that there's a discouragement out there, or there isn't sufficient demand, and there isn't much wage pressure. We used to talk a lot about the trade-off between wages and inflation. That subject has almost disappeared from the Federal Reserve and from Wall Street forecasters. They called it Nehru. I'm stumbling on what Nehru means, the non-inflationary. Well, I'll drop it. I won't.
I'm not sure it'll hold the attention of our audience anymore.
At any rate, it was we don't talk about that anymore. Because of layoffs, and this is the subject that I've been writing and that I did my book about, The Disposable American, we have sort of acquiesced, and I trace that out, in job insecurity. We have agreed to accept that, and we have, as a result, agreed to accept no bargaining power, if you will. Job insecurity is closely related to weak wage growth. You can't get wage growth if you can't demand it, and with some sort of assurance that you won't get laid off in the process. So the inflationary pressures that used to exist from wages driving up prices, and then prices creating more demand for higher wages, that isn't there anymore. And partly it's not there because we've acquiesced to layoffs. Partly it's not there because we have such a supply of labor from abroad in the form of imports. And immigration has helped quite a bit as well. So we have, it's quite amazing. We say that if people would just get the right education or the right training, the demand for them will be there. In fact, every indicator shows that there isn't the demand there. The supply of labor at all levels, educated and otherwise, is greater than the demand for it. Now, if you're educated, if you're an engineer driving a taxi cab, you're more likely to get an engineering job once one comes open than a taxi driver than someone without an education. I mean, if there's two people driving a taxi cab, one doesn't have any education, he goes on driving the taxi cab. The engineer moves up to an engineering job. But those engineering jobs are hard to find, so how soon he moves up, God only knows these days.
It seems like you might have better luck getting a job in another country than in this country.
Well, that's an interesting question. The wages aren't so good yet in those other countries, but that is probably true. And it would be interesting at some point to begin to, there will probably be stories over the next 5 or 10 years about Americans going abroad to work, particularly as the internal market in China develops.
Returning to the issue of the Fed and inflation, the new chairman has talked about transparency a lot, and I just wonder what you think that means and what the impact will be on the average American of his comments to that regard.
Well, putting that in context, Greenspan over the years, when he started, he was very much against any sort of transparency.
And let's say what we mean by that. I mean, you and I are familiar with the term.
Yeah, all right. Transparency means that when the Fed does something, they announce it, and they make it very clear where what their thinking is. When they raise rates, they announce it, and they also announce fairly quickly their reasoning. We've moved tremendously in that direction. When Greenspan came in, they'd have a Fed meeting, policymakers would meet, and you wouldn't know for sure what they had done anything for 6 weeks until the minutes were published, and there would be endless stories and insider stories about what the Fed did or didn't do. Now, of course, they announce it within an hour of acting, and what rate changes they've made. They still wait 6 weeks to say how the discussion went, and you still have to wait 5 years in order to get a transcript of the meetings. Bernanke is committed. Greenspan has already moved the process very far along, and Bernanke is committed to moving it even further along, which means that maybe we'll get the transcripts of the meetings within a week or two, and we'll get the minutes of the meetings sooner.
Good news for journalists.
Good news for journalists, good news for the public, I think. The argument against it was, and Greenspan used to make it, that that the Fed policymakers, who are the governors of the Fed and the presidents of the regional banks of the Federal Reserve, would be inhibited in their discussion. The transcripts show that most of the discussion is dominated by the Fed chairman anyway, and it's pretty pro forma, so it would be sort of, and there are occasional outbursts, but we should know about that. I mean, we should know what the dynamics are in this very important process that determines how we live.
One of the reasons that I get the sense he's concerned about transparency is that he's flirting with the idea, if you will, of pegging inflation, saying publicly, this is the inflation rate I want to target, and having everybody know that, which I wonder what your reaction is to that idea and what you think the financial markets might do with that.
I don't think there's a problem. I think that Bernanke has also said, he's certainly made it clear to journalists, that while he would peg the inflation rate at, say, 2%, he would do it with a great deal of flexibility, and that's the key. And that brings him Greenspan, for all practical purposes, was pegging the inflation rate at about 2%, but he was not acknowledging that, and he was being very flexible. Bernanke has also said that, look, if I start seeing if it goes above 2%, but I see that because of the economy it's moving back down or will soon, I'm not going to jump in to shove it back down to 2%. And if he sees it's drifting up, but in not a particularly inflationary way, he's not going to jump in either. He has also used the concept of flexibility in describing how he would deal with pegging. For him, pegging is a band. You'd have to get up to 3 or even more than 3% before he starts shoving it back down again.
Do you think the financial markets are likely to sort of absorb the transition between these two Fed chairmen fairly smoothly, or do you think it's going to be a little choppy?
I think it'll be fairly smooth, unless Bernanke does something to put his foot in his mouth. And he doesn't sound like a man, from what I know of him, he doesn't sound like someone who would put his foot in his mouth.
But he certainly is less experienced than Greenspan was when he took over, and he, of course, faced the crash of 1987 just several months after he was confirmed, and I just wonder whether Bernanke is prepared for sudden financial crises the way
we
Greenspan
won't know until it happens. I mean, academically, by temperament, I think he is, but we just simply won't know.
Describe his personality a little bit. You know him somewhat.
Well, he's a calm man. He's very thoughtful. He doesn't jump in with sort of instinctive ideas about productivity. Greenspan used to talk about how he didn't have to raise interest rates because productivity was increasing the supply of goods. He's much more aware of the global economy than I think Greenspan is. Greenspan is very aware of it, but by nature he was from the old school, a contained economy. He's a family man. He grew up in a religious background in the South, and went on. It was an outstanding student right from the start, and so outstanding that he got 1600 or 1598 on his SAT. He was so good that he won the prize, a prize that took him on a trip to Europe, and went on to Harvard. Parents didn't know anything about Harvard. They thought they'd send him to Brandeis because there was a Jewish background there. Well, he went to Harvard, and he did outstanding work there. So he's very much a scholar.
Well, it sounds like a good place to start.
Yeah.
You mentioned how strong his understanding is of the global economy, and certainly there's been a lot of discussion about the large looming U.S. budget deficit and our ongoing large and looming trade deficits, and the potential impact of that on the dollar. Do you see that as a big threat to the economy going forward, and do you think he does? I
think he, I've interviewed him on this point once. I think he believes that if the Chinese raise the value, revalue their currency, raise its value vis-a-vis the dollar, then there will be a self-correcting mechanism. Because Chinese exports get more and more expensive, there will be more production here, and we will begin to save, spend less, and buy more at home. I find that perhaps ingenuous, in that the Chinese have a huge stake in not raising the value of their currency, in increasing the output and employment of their own people. We seem to have a huge stake in being able to consume, and I think that's not just some American characteristic. That's driven by a whole system of advertising and marketing and everything else. I don't know how you reverse that. It's not just simply, if you ask me why, if the Fed is powerful, in this respect they're not. They can raise interest rates, or they can lower interest rates, or the Chinese can come in and revalue their currency. But will we stop spending, or will there be some sort of a social problem here, particularly if the value of our homes goes down? Bernanke, to some extent, will be under pressure then not to let the value of the dollar drop. And you can see it a little bit in a division among manufacturers. There are manufacturers, small manufacturers, I've written about this, quite vehement about wanting some sort of protection for themselves because they see their production slipping abroad. And the big ones, like Caterpillar and others, and any number of other companies who have production in China, not only for export back to the United States, but to serve the Chinese market, they don't want that to happen. They want the Chinese currency to remain weak.
Sounds like something he's going to have to work on.
He has a problem that's a difficult problem.
Yeah. We've been very fortunate to have Louis Uchitelle, senior economics writer for the New York Times, as our guest today. Lou, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
We'll be right back.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, With students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
The world has changed considerably since Alan Greenspan was appointed Fed chairman in 1987. Principally, the sources of inflation in the economy are no longer the traditional ones, like wage pressures driven by strong unions and excessive demand for products produced by a finite number of American factories. The global economy, with its seemingly endless supply of low-wage workers, products, and capital, has changed all that. Today, inflation seems to be driven more by a glut in global savings, which allows financial bubbles to build up in areas like housing and internet stocks. Bernanke has indicated that he may try to tighten lending standards of banks as a way to wage war against that inflation, rather than relying on the conventional Fed weapon of ratcheting up interest rates. President Bush has been widely criticized for using ideology as his litmus test for candidates for other important positions. How refreshing, then, to see the appointment of a new Fed chairman who is willing to rely on pragmatism and empirical research as his guide. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.